Matty, it's so nice to meet you. I'm so glad that we got mutually introduced by Matt Fripp.
Yeah, I'm really glad he introduced us as well. It's nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because checking out your website, your Bandcamp website, you have a prolific amount of work out there that spans the gamut of just about everything. And I find that really fascinating. So I definitely want to talk about that. But before we go on, let's
Mhm.
let people get to know who you are and, where are you from? When did you get started in music? And what led you to be playing the saxophone?
Yeah, okay, so take it back to the beginning, I guess, right?
Yes.
Like like toddler era kind of beginning.
Moment of birth. If you could remember back that far.
Earliest recollection ever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
that's
mine
deep. That's
mine I think was I don't know if this was a nightmare. I swear. I think I remember falling out of the crib. I don't know if it's true. And I know
ooh.
my parents weren't there. I think there was someone a babysitter or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's it's not about me. Let me get to
Yeah,
you.
yeah. That would be something I would remember. So, um yeah, we'll stay with the positive memories. I guess you know what? Musically speaking, one of the earliest memories I have is my dad's vinyl collection. It's just kind of like in the living room or the den, common space. Everyone can see it. I was allowed to just put my hands on it. I wasn't like snapped at. It wasn't like kept in mint condition. It was just something for. It was there. My dad did not, and my family in general. I don't come from like a pedigree of musicians specifically, but they are artists. So my both my parents were trained as visual artists. I do
Oh,
have a distant great aunt who apparently was a singer with the Metropolitan Opera named Reese Stevens, and she like won Grammys or something back in her time.
wow.
So I only heard that story much, much later. So, but I had no real reason for going down this path in terms of family line. But there were those records, and they did run across a gamut. And I just remember that my dad saying years later that he took a lot of music appreciation classes in college, and he had friends who were musicians, and he went to the High School of Music and Art, so the artists hung out with the musicians.
Oh,
It's kind of like a storied, legendary high school in New York City, and so I mean, he was kind of worldly, right, and interested, had a lot of interest. And some of those records, I mean, definitely not sax inclined initially. Like there was like Usual Suspects. There was like Beatles, and there was for kids stuff. There was like Harry Nilsson did a kids album called The Point, and I just remember that being like a huge memory for me, and just the sound of the crackle uh, of the turntable um, made a huge impression. There were jazz records that I remember even in the early times. Like I remember this interesting compilation album that had like a Picasso, the guitarist, that painting on the cover, and it was called "The Blues in Modern Jazz." And I remember there were cuts from like Mingus and the Modern Jazz Quartet and Art Blakey on that record, and it was just kind of like interesting because I like the idea of like a curated album. It's more of a compilation type of approach, and everything had a theme. It was like, well, is this blues or is it jazz, and what is each of these things? And I was like 8 years old, maybe less. So there
wow.
was Sonny Rollins in there. There was a lot of different stuff. So I didn't start taking lessons formally till I was 8 years old. Started taking piano, and then the next year, the band guy came to demo all the instruments in the school, and I kind of like, and I could tell that sax was his main instrument, and he had kind of that Gato Barbieri look with the long hair and the hippie kind of vibe that was pretty popular in the early '80s. So I took up sax because I thought he was cool, and also we had a guy living with us who was one of my dad's former students at Union College, where he taught stage design and visual art. Um, but he was a sax player, and they weren't that apart in age because my dad had just started his career in those days. So he was living with us in like in the attic space, like in the first year or year and a half of my life. And his name is Chuck Fisher, and he actually had like he toured with like Blood, Sweat and Tears and Laurie Anderson, and he did a lot of like work on TV commercials and this kind of thing. So he kind of like knew the life of living in New York, gigging, and he had a lot of different musical interests. And many years later, I took lessons, just free lessons with him. But I just remember like there would not be that sort of aura of saxophone had he not been there from the beginning. Um,
What's
so
interesting is that you said that you didn't come from a pedigree of musicians per se, but you know what? You were in the environment. You know, you had
mhm,
you
mhm.
had Chuck in the house. Your parents were both visual artists. You were in New York City. You had that vinyl collection. So there was definitely something there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there was another friend in the family who was like a more of a singer songwriter type. And years later, a guy with his quartet came. I can speak to him later because I've done recordings with him in more recent days, but he's like more my father's age. Um, and, it was that Union College. I grew up in Schenectady, New York, in upstate New York. So being kind of like a college brat, I guess, you're exposed to more than your usual, like run of the mill kind of like uh, I don't know, run down kind of like town that whose former glory has long since passed. I mean, like Schenectady was kind of known as
Yeah,
like as the electric city. Thomas Edison did a lot of his inventions there. They have General Electric was based there, but that was like a bygone era.
yeah.
And I always thought Schenectady was initially like that. It was kind of on the downturn when I was growing up. I think it's doing a little better now, but um, yeah. So, but being in that college, having the association with the local college nearby, definitely exposed me to different things. And I got to travel because of my parents and stuff like that. So that was cool. Um, as far as the training, when I started taking piano, it was like a Suzuki method. So I was kind of more emphasizing my ear before learning to read. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I think there were some positives to that and maybe some drawbacks, but that's how it began with that. And I kind of learned to read more on saxophone just by playing in the school band. So it was kind of almost like splitting the brain two ways. And I remember singing a lot and being in middle school chorus, high school chorus. I did a lot of that. I did a lot of all state with chorus, all state with jazz band.
Okay.
There were some cool teachers. Nick Brignola, who was like a downbeat perennial winning baritone saxophonist, was local to this area and still lived in the area long after. It's only this town's only about 3 hours north of New York City, so people could still go to the city and play and stuff like that. But I used to take a few lessons with him in high school. Another guy that people haven't heard of, but he was good for like learning rudiments. Um,
So yeah, I'm originally from New York State as well, and I could
mhm,
attest to the fact I think the school music programs I think in most of New York are really good, and we both got exposed to music at an early age, where some states unfortunately and some countries unfortunately people aren't until like maybe they're in seventh grade, around that age and stuff like that.
mm.
Yeah, but so this is interesting though. You said you were trained piano Suzuki and that developed your ears first. How hard of it when you first started playing saxophone? You probably taught like me read and play at the same time. You mentioned split brain. How hard was that for you at first, if anything?
Um, I don't know. It was just what you did. Like everyone remembers that Standard of Excellence book or Breeds Easy method or
Yeah.
whatever people were doing at that time. That's just how you learned. It was like these little short one-line pieces designed to scaffold your learning to a point where you could play a one-page piece with a school band. And and I didn't think much of it. I remember like I was kind of like a good like obedient student in terms of like making sure I practice whatever the thing on that page for that week was assigned. But then I would do a lot of time, a lot of playing after the fact, where I just kind of close my eyes and try to listen to the sound and try to like key in on what is the sound. and I can't. I was like, I guess I can't call it improvisation at that point. Like I barely could make a G major scale in an alto, but I knew how to like create. Like I could figure out from one point to the next how the intervals sounded to me because I was already dealing with that by ear on the piano.
Piano. Yeah.
So it wasn't hard to transition. I wouldn't say it was like strictly about reading with saxophone, is it what I'm saying? I guess basically whatever the Suzuki did in those lessons kind of started to rub off in other areas as well.
I was going to
Um,
ask that too because I could, from all the students I've taught and people I've spoken to who have started on piano first, it's certainly helped their, whatever instrument they're playing, or at least inform their instrument playing. And I guess it depends too how you were trained on piano. It's interesting because upstate New York, there's certain pockets where it's not just Suzuki, but it's also music learning theory. I've had a number of
mhm,
guests. I'm certified in that, but I did not grow up learning that way at all. I didn't even hear about it until I was done with actually one of my master's degrees as well. But upstate New York, there's pockets like Buffalo, Rochester, maybe Ithaca, but where music learning theory is very big, and it's just
mhm,
essentially ears before eyes. So I could
mhm.
see that. It's funny when you mentioned, you just close your eyes, you kind of listen to the sound, and even though you didn't have a full G scale there, just that I find it amazing that you had the wherewithal to even just like think that way, at such a young age.
Mhm. Well, thanks. I mean, again, I'll credit just being exposed, my dad's record collection and all that stuff. Like I knew there was a world out there and I just had to figure out ways to tap into it. It was a struggle because I'm on like a junky student model horn that like you're just dealing with the conditions and I didn't know how to tell my parents like what I needed for gear or anything like that. Like I don't really you're going to learn much later in this interview that I don't have a huge repertoire of vocabulary in terms of talking about shop or gear. Like I kind of settled a long time ago on stuff that I like to use, and I don't try to like really vary that too much. So, um,
That's very freeing.
I it freeing by constraint, like it's been a necessity. So, and I also have a method for teaching the saxophone in the studio and just music in general where like I think your sound really is mostly coming from within, and you can help it along with some gear choices, but I really think that your voice, like because I remember Nick Brignola in a lesson in high school proved to me that he could get the same sound on my stupid alto sax that he got on his, and he took my horn and he proved it with the same stock mouthpiece, you know and that, I don't know, that made more of an impression than any of the bebop lines he ever played or anything else that like he was known for. It was like that notion that like your musical personality really is inside of you, and the instrument is just an extension of the human voice. So I really tried to investigate that full, like whole hog after that experience. Thomas Chapin was another guy I studied a few lessons with much later in college, who also kind of like ascribed to the same kind of mindset in terms of like your sound. What is your sound? Your sound doesn't have to be my sound, but it's got to be something that you find out for yourself. And there are different approaches you can to get you on the path toward that a lot of people like will put in their books and everything, but you have to like it starts with closing your eyes and opening up your ears, I think.
When
Yeah.
you say, yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's take a left turn here. So obviously Nick had a huge influence, right? And Thomas Chapin as well. How did they help you find your sound?
Well, um it, that formative experience, the story I just told about Nick,
Yeah,
was just he just proved that it's possible and it doesn't have to be, you know, just because it is Nick doing it.
right.
Like he told me that I could do that too. I just have to like put the time in. Um and Thomas played a plastic reed, which I, from the beginning I knew that was not me. But but I knew that he made it work for him in a way that like he had a huge sound, and it sounded kind of like it was a little off kilter, but I also knew that like he had played with Lionel Hampton and done a lot of like straight ahead playing before he went into his wild and crazy phase. So it was really about just like there's the technical materials, but you're using it in the service of getting it to artistically where you want to be. Whatever that is for you, that's what you have to do. And so I realized that. And both those guys taught me early on that your sound isn't only about, not only is it not only about the gear choice, it's not even entirely about the long tones exclusively and the overtone exercise and all those things that have to do with timbre, or being more flexible with your embouchure in order to sculpt the sound. That's huge as well, obviously. But your time, like the when of the attack of the sound is perhaps the most important part of the sound because it's like the first impression of the long tone itself, right? So like when that happens, and it doesn't matter if it's like over a tune that's in time or you're just playing rubato or whatever. It's just like feeling that, like having that swing mindset, whether it's like traditional swing or like where you're playing free or whatever, but like having it swing, quote unquote, in a certain, because there's an aesthetic that you're going for. That's part of the sound too, right? It's the attack. There's an attack. There's a decay, sustain, and release. Every tone has a sound envelope to it, and it was the first time I really like started to appreciate that for what it was, because music is a temporal art form, so it's sound moving in time, and that's a very distinctive thing from, say, looking at a painting. So that stuck with me as well.
That's so interesting. I'm curious about one thing, and this is going to sound weird to some people, but was there? Did you have experience with marching band?
Oh yeah,
Okay, you
oh
know why
yeah.
I'm saying that? Because and I only know this from moving out to California. Marching band was not big. I'm from Long Island. Long Island, excuse me, I have to say in one word.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Mepham, which one? Which
No, that's
which
too far.
county?
Nassau.
Suffolk, Nassau, Nassau.
Nassau, yeah, where it's all congested and all that kind of crazy stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, marching band was not big at all, and we had the worst uniforms. I mean, we looked like skunks. It was just like these big hats with like the black hats with the white. It was awful, polyester, just terrible. But anyway, when I moved out here in Southern California, marching band is huge. In the
Mm.
Midwest, it's huge. Everywhere else but Long Island, it's huge. And I remember as I was attending some like training events, how they were really harping on the attack and the release. And
Hmm.
and when you said that, I just thought, I wonder if he has marching band or if he had marching band experience.
It's interesting you bring up that because, yeah, I think the height of the high school marching band program when I was there was my freshman year, because we had a real ringer, some guy who was like headed for Curtis Music Institute as the lead trumpet player in as senior year, and a drum corps, and like it all rests on that. That was really tight and worked well together, and we were kind of like fundraising, so we go uh, play in Mardi Gras down in New Orleans. We were going to like do the two parades for that.
Wow.
So we did it. We didn't do those crazy elaborate halftime field shows that you get in the Deep South and Midwest and that kind of thing. Like it wasn't as robust a program as all that. But you did have a leader who was like an old school guy who kind of knew like Alexander's Ragtime Band and classics like that, and knew how to get, I don't want to say militaristic, but everyone kind of like being really like all in as a team as much as possible. And I just remember like if the drummers are that psyched about like just having those rudiments and those drills kind of like really real, the timing of it be real key, then I have to do my part too, you know, as the horn player. And I also like it's kind of like section leader, so I kind of like I had to lead by example and also get the other guys like, to kind of like key into my sound, and we have to sound good together. And I just think that marching band isn't always given the credit it's due, because it's not the most challenging music, because you're doing two things at once anyway, so that's by design. but it is kind of the most like team oriented music in a way.
It's like a sport.
It is. So I will always value that experience because of that. Yeah.
And what's interesting too, and this is a perfect, that was a perfect segue when you talked about when I asked about, you're developing your sound, what exactly did that mean for you? And, you did mention something to the effect of, how you're approaching the attack, and then marching band, the really, really good marching band directors will focus on that because a really great sounding marching band sounds like one person on a whole bunch of instruments. And, it's obviously also about looks and how everybody looks and, spot on uniform, all that kind of thing. But it's more musical than people think. A lot of people tend to believe that marching band, you're just going outside and you're blowing your brains out. There's no musicality whatsoever, but that is so far from the truth.
Yeah. And I'd like to say one more thing about attack. I learned many years later, talking grad school at New England Conservatory, when Alan Chase, who's running the jazz department at the time, uh, who himself had learned from Joe Allard, gave me a packet of warm-ups. And it was the first time I really started to see an attack on the saxophone as really a release. Because I wasn't, I mean, maybe I was subconsciously doing it all along, but I really had to like consciously think of it from that point on, was just the idea of you're pushing air out, but it's stopped with the tongue. And only when you take the tongue off the reed does the sound begin. So you're kind of thinking in the reverse with the woodwinds as you would on a drum. And I didn't get to appreciate how to make the woodwind sound more like a percussion instrument in terms of attack until I realized until I appreciated the differences between the two instrument families in that way, and started thinking and be able to like leverage that in a percussive context, and also kind of like mess around a little bit on percussion instruments and try to find the commonalities between like what is timing of a beginning of a sound on a saxophone, like how do I make that sound like the timing of striking something with a stick, you know
It's
anyway that
that level of precision, that, and this is like a very, very mini recap, but just when you were starting out on saxophone, again, closing your eyes and thinking and hearing the sound. It's that level of precision and depth of hearing that's really fascinating because we're gonna, one of the things that you're really into is the electro acoustics, and this is, we're gonna be getting to that. I could see how the progression is going with this. Um, when did you when did you get interested, or did you know that you were going to pursue music as a career?
well, I had a lot of interest in high school, so it wasn't clear then. I was into the theater as well, and I liked all my subject areas, so it wasn't clear then. I went to a liberal arts college, Wesleyan University, so I ended up a music major, but I didn't declare for the longest time. And I was taking Russian and
Wow.
history and little acting, So anyway, even when I started declared major there, it's like you could still go to grad school for something else after you're done. So it wasn't, I was still keeping my options open. But the music program at Wesleyan was a little, I don't know, different from like say a music school or conservatory environment in that like it was more of like an eclectic hodgepodge of different types of professors. They had this world music thing going on that's pretty strong at that place, very strong. Um, you could take you could audition for the concerto competition, even though I didn't consider myself a classical person first. I just went for it and I got it. I got the feature for that. Or learn how to conduct, whatever you wanted to do. You could learn music just the way you were learning all of the liberal arts. Is kind of like do what you want, try anything out, just try stuff out. And I still didn't think of it as a career at that point. I was starting to like hustle gigs locally, um, but it was really at the like middle of senior year. I was like, I kind of want to do this, and it was after I'd taken time off from undergrad, like a year off.
Oh,
I
okay.
did a term abroad, and I also spent one semester in New York City just kind of living life, not doing a whole heck of a lot. I did a couple internships at arts organizations, but I was really just trying to go to the clubs at night and sit in at jam sessions and just figure out what that was all about. And I took lessons with Thomas a lot at that time. So it was like, okay, so there's a scene. Then I learned like what was current as a music scene for in jazz and other kinds of music as well in New York City from a certain time period, from like the early to mid '90s. And it's just like, okay, can I make this work? Can I like go for this? And do I have what it takes? And I kind of decided at the end, well, I think there's still a little bit investigating on like trying to like iron out some of the weak spots in my playing that I never really did, that other people probably went through those paces already. So I applied to grad school, and that's kind of like when I kind of glued it all together at New England Conservatory. And I really like, okay, well, if I'm here for this, then I probably should try to like make a run for it, make a go of it as a career. Yeah.
What's interesting, you had just said that it took a process for you to come to that decision, and you had said that you were thinking, okay, I've got to iron out some weak spots, and people may have done this like maybe in high school, and you're a few years later and stuff like that. Did that? How did how did that make you feel in terms of, did you feel like you were behind in any way? I mean, it sounds like to me you got into New England Conservatory, and so it didn't sound like there were probably too many weak spots, but did it make you feel a little panicked, feel like you're behind in any way?
I did not feel a ton of confidence at all. I got in there, but I did not get into another place I auditioned to. And on top of it, I was able to like prepare for the audition and focus just on like that very focused thing. But I don't think it really spoke to me that it proved that I really knew what I was doing. I was able to focus on just getting ready for the audition. And I did make an impression on like Jerry Bergonzi at the audition, which made me feel super great. It meant, oh, great, now I get to be in a studio. And also, I had worked a lot on sight reading, so I didn't feel like I was going to like do badly with that portion of it. And I think they liked the fact that I knew enough on some doubles that they kind of saw me as like someone who could play in the big band. So that's probably why it was a reality for me there, at that time. And some of it's just dumb luck, it's like depends on who's the field auditioning that year, So passing one thing didn't prove anything to me at all. And I knew that quickly within the first few weeks. It was just like, I heard some cats who could just blow, and just in the practice room is like, your confidence goes, way down. So I had to learn how to like block that out and focus on my practicing. The sound bled through those practice rooms a lot. There's no like sound reinforcement at all in that old building. So, which surprised me about a really renowned institution, but whatever, I really had to learn how to just worry about me and go at my own pace. Whatever was, wherever I was at, if I tried to reach for the stars too soon, it wasn't going to work. So I had to inch along at the pace that I could do.
Yeah, and especially, New England Conservatory is a great school. It's a very expensive school too,
Yeah.
but it's part of the Boston scene too. So were you also getting out into that scene and jamming and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, Wally's.
Yeah.
There was actually at that time, the NEC cats. I mean, a lot of them did go to Wally's too, but a lot of Berkeley that was kind of dominated by Berkeley students, which right down the street. At that time, there was like this friendly rivalry between the schools. Nowadays, it's like graduates of it don't care about that kind of thing anymore, because then you're out in the working world. But at the time, it's kind of funny how like students can be. But there was another little like dive bar in the other direction down Huntington Avenue, away from Berkeley, towards the west of town. That was called the Chopping Block. It's not there anymore. But a lot of NEC people would put together little bands and just play there and just try stuff out, test things out there. I remember going to that place a lot and just listening to other groups. And then eventually I put one of my own together. And so you want to probably eventually segue to Dead Cat Bounce.
Yes, I do.
Dead Cat Bounce, started first as a one-off gig my senior year at Wesleyan University, which was really meant that the auspices of that one performance in town in Middletown, Connecticut, was supposed to be a poetry and music collaboration with a former roommate of mine who is a great Russian poet. And I wanted to do something beatniky and write music for the occasion that kind of like would be a setting for his words. And I did hire 3 other saxes besides myself, and then there was also trumpet on that gig, and so it was a little different from what the band turned out to be, but close. And I wrote a couple pieces for that turned out to be what you hear on the first record they put out later. But I brought that group. Then I took the sax section from the NEC big band later the next year, and some of the rhythm section players from that big band. And we put together a sextet to just try out some of this new material I was working with. And then I wrote some of that stuff in the practice room that semester, so that I pretty much had the first album's worth of material right away when we started rehearsing. And I felt good about that. I had a lot more confidence back then when I knew nothing about like putting projects together and being brave enough to ask people to be a part of them than I do now. Now it's like, well, I don't know. He's played with so-and-so, and, I got to make sure that, there's enough money there and all that stuff. But when we're all kids, it's like, yeah, let's just play, let's just do that.
Just go for it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
when did you, I'm curious, a couple of things. When did you start getting interested in composition? And I have to ask about, how did you come up with the name Dead Cat Bounce?
Yeah, well, that's a stock market term.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know that.
It is. It was like so nascent in the English lexicon, like new terms, right around that time, like the late 90s. And I found it in a book of like new terms to enter the English language. And it was really, it's a precipitous decline in stock price, followed by a brief recovery, the bounce. But it's really just an illusion that, like the economy is not really head back to normal again. It's just even a dead cat can bounce and make it seem like he's alive for a second, but he's really not. Now, I have to tell you that I got in a lot of trouble with a couple venues, one of them who even threatened to report me to the ASPCA at one point. Like I was applying to a jazz festival on Long Island, actually. It was Long Island. I remember this. And she mailed me a typed on a typewriter letter, like total vitriol. And we owned 2 cats. My then girlfriend, who became my wife later, and we had 2 cats, and love cats. It's just, I don't know. The title is more about having like an edge to the sound more than anything. I like metaphors and things that like stand in for other types of vibes and feelings. And I also didn't like the conservatism in the jazz scene. I wanted to be more punk rock about it, like so-and-so's quartet or whatever the heck people most of the time do. I just wasn't interested in that, So I take my lead more from like Sex Pistols or The Clash or, like anything that sounds a little edgier. I listened to all kinds of music in growing up. So to me, there are no divisions, but I learned from the establishment the way you're supposed to behave when dealing with authority much later. And I just never really understood that. So the places that were willing to hire me, despite the name of the band, did so, and the ones that wouldn't just didn't, and that's the way it was.
Wow, that's so interesting. That's a great story. That's a great story. And you kind of alluded to the next, or the other part of the question that I had. Such an eclectic listening experience, right? But growing up in the establishment, but also not wanting to be defined by it. So when did you start composing music?
Well, I had some very awkward attempts in middle and high school. A lot of them were kind of like rock songs with lyrics. Some of them was like well, here's something in the style of Jimi Hendrix. Here's something in the style of the Beatles or Neil Young or whatever. And then my first little like jazz piece was kind of like after I had been kind of immersed in Brubeck Take Five album for a long time and was really interested in how he was like pastiching these little different jazz subgenre styles, as well as kind of like these experiments in rhythm and time signatures that he was into, that he was known for, and and the works being sectional, kind of almost like a suite, like a mini suite within one composition. So I kind of did that with a piano piece once. And I was living abroad with my dad. He was teaching in England for a semester, so I actually premiered that at a concert at the school I was attending in England, and I think some people liked it, and the headmaster, I remember, thought it was just kind of weird, but it was like, it had different things, and I called it Strange Dove. Anyway, that was not, that was like a serious piece for me without knowing what I was doing. And then later on, my first Dead Cat Bounce piece in college, when I was trying to get ready for that event that I told you about with the poetry, I didn't know how to write things down to hear several voices in my head in advance so that I could write on a multi-stave score format, whether by hand or I was trying to struggle to learn the finale for the first time. It was like one of the first versions of finale ever.
Oh, and that it sucked. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So I had to crash course that for like a month in August one summer and just not do anything else. And I came out better for it, but man, those were the tough early days. But I actually wrote that one tune on a Roland keyboard that had multi-track functionality to it. So you could write a voice, and it was almost like these layers. It was kind of like a groove tune. I called it Ictus Blues Us. And it was like kind of like blues with a backbeat, but it had polyphony in the counter melodies and things going on and stuff. So I started kind of like with what is kind of the background. It's like voiced in thirds. So that's two of the middle saxes would eventually play that line. It's like da 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 is the little motif. And then much later, I added kind of like this. What's the term in medieval? The descant. It's like the above counter melody, yeah. And that was end up the flute part for that. I ended up playing flute as like, so that was like the counter melody, and then the Barry was kind of doing like this funky other counter bass line to what the bass player was doing. And I realized this is the way I hear things. I want lots of busy stuff going on, and I kind of like polyphony. And not a lot of jazz is actually about polyphony. A lot of it is about homophony, block chord writing, or voiced melodies, right? Moving in, if it's big band, like that's kind of how they hear a lot of that writing is, the traditional writing, you know? So I was like, yeah, I'm just doing what I hear. I'm using available technology, however limited. And then the feedback I'd get was like, Matt, like, you ever think about going to study how to do this more? And that turned out to be a double-edged sword, because I was like, when you end up studying composition formally, years later, you have to unlearn that in order to get back to that place you were at where you knew nothing, but you had nothing but instinct and bravado. And you were just like a cocky little early 20-year-old something who was just like, I'm just going to do what I want to do, man. No one's going to stop me. So life is a balancing act after that. You have to be humble enough to learn new things. And you also have to you can't let that early confidence just like totally go by the wayside. So that's hard.
Or the early creativity too, because that yeah. I just like actually took a note when you said that, because that really is so true. We do learn the foundation, but then we're told you have to break the foundation. But hopefully by that point, you're not so stuck in the foundation that you've lost any sense of creativity.
Yeah, I know. That was it. So, and the second tune I wrote for them was like this kind of like second line inspired, like New Orleans-y kind of thing, called Hot Peas and Butter. And it had like singing and shouting and hand clapping at the end, kind of like Charles Mingus would used to do with some of his pieces, or how those brass bands in New Orleans do. and I knew how to do that because I see that more as like simple music. It's like folk music. It's like music of the people, it's street music, you know. So I was able to figure out how to write that stuff out, and that taught me a lot about how to like write things with entertainment value and write things that are more audience participatory. And that was very important for me to keep with me as I started learning in the classroom more things about like more cerebral types of writing after that. If it was like atonal music or, you know, chordal harmonies or, you know, like triadic over different bass line kind of stuff or whatever that was making it moving towards a more modern sound or using crazy metric modulations or whatever came later. I never lost that hunger to try to, I don't know, please an audience is kind of maybe taking it a little too far. But I do aim to please to a certain extent, even though a lot of my music, the way it manifests, comes out very weird, and sometimes it doesn't have the effect of, say, like a, you know, like what a pop song would. But I do think there are ways of connecting with listeners that is often lost in jazz writing. Let's put it that way.
All right, no, we're going to expand upon that, and I think also what you're maybe meaning too, not necessarily please, but to interest the audience, to pique the audience's attention and keep them, you know, interested in listening.
Yeah, yeah. When people like you react to my music and say, well, it's very eclectic. I mean, the eclecticism happens on two levels. It can happen from project to project, song to song, 3 levels, or within the song. Sometimes I'm like hopping genres, or the sections are just changing so drastically, whether it's tempo, feel, levels of density. You know, I like areas of contrast happening, and that can happen in an abstract way with instrumental music, where you're not like spelling it out for the audience, but the audience can clearly perceive a strong contrast taking place. That, I think, that can happen on a visceral level, you know. But it's also in the performative side of things where, I mean, I never got that band to really play off book because a lot of the stuff was notated too much to really be able to do that, unless, I don't know, that would have been a level of commitment that we never really got to. But I read enough not looking at the page to a point now where I was able to like look up at the audience enough in a way that I could connect, you know. So that body language I find is really important too. The body language is also key when looking at each other peripherally on stage to cue the unwritten sections going from section to section, especially in the open sections where improv is happening. I learned a ton about that and how jazz is really, in writing in that style, is a balancing act between written notes and unwritten notes, you know, and you can't overwrite. You have to try not to overwrite. And I learned the hard way. Actually, my early experiments was stuff like you're writing stuff that the computer can do, like Finale can play it back, but humans can't necessarily. Right?
Expand on that. So, like, give us an example. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I wrote, we did record this, but we didn't play it live after that. It was on our 3rd record. It was called the Department of Homeland Strategy. That was a term that George W. Bush, it was like a malapropism of his from that era. And the music in that was as crazy as the title, like, because it was just very, very hard. There was a section in 15/8 time, and there's some great small bands that can really play like with great organic feel in odd time signatures like that. Now, that was just starting to come into being then, and with my writing, that 15/8 only happens for a short part of the piece. So it doesn't really last long enough to really like get deep into the groove, because then I'm on to something else right away, because I want the audience to remain interested, you know. And so, and guess maybe in those days I was a little more of a control freak. Like there's a little more maximalist writing in that period of my writing than there is now. Now I'm trying to find ways of writing things in the most simple, direct way possible to get people to a complex state as a band on their own, through organic means, so that like there's more flow to it, but it took years to learn how to do that. I think sometimes the finale notation software was more of an impediment. I kind of sometimes wish, or in the early days, I had written more things out by hand so that I could like make sure I heard it first as a real person playing it before I did it. But then it was more like backwards. I was kind of learning by trial and error. I'd bring it to the rehearsal, and they'd be like, well, sometimes they were nice about it. They're like, okay, I'll keep practicing. But I should have known after 3 or 4 tries. I was like, well, maybe the problem is in the writing. I should go back and try to like edit the writing, So
That's so interesting. And as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, hand writing it out by hand versus finale. There's also that kinesthetic thing too, where you could certainly notate things easier without the constraints of a finale or a Sibelius, where you're kind of pressured into making sure it, you know what I'm saying, making sure it fits, a certain rhythm or whatever that may be. It's really interesting, and how you're approaching composition, and how, again, going from your very early beginnings, being exposed to all that vinyl, you know what I mean, and the different people that came into your life, and just how you looked at things. And I think it's safe for me to say, like, you probably don't categorize or try to categorize your music, because it's just, I can't, I could use the word eclectic, I guess, but it just covers so many different types of things. And it's not even, one piece is different from another one, different from another one. And you had said that within one piece, you're developing and exploring different genres and all that kind of thing. So it makes it hard to categorize.
yeah, and it hasn't always resonated with critics. I mean, equally, right? I've gotten a lot of positive response for that approach, and then a couple once in a while it was like, who is this guy? Like, does he have an identity? Like, there's so much. It just keeps changing, right? But my response to that is basically, the artist is the voice is me, and the genre is just the vehicle through which I express me. So what I'm trying to do is have these different settings, these milieus that I set up. There's like different situations, and I hope that by setting it up, the band hears music hears new opportunities in how they're going to inject their own individuality, right? By creating these different settings, differentiated sometimes by genre, sometimes by something in the mechanics of the music that's changing rapidly. Later on, as I started writing more vocal-oriented stuff, something in the text that's changing rapidly. Whatever the case may be, just trying to show and also maybe it's a statement about not setting up too many divisions between types of music in the world. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember like the Tower Records days and just like thumbing through, but that was like
I worked there. I loved it.
Yeah, I mean,
the classical section.
it was great. It was great to have something tangible to touch, and to be able to look at stuff and decide before you buy it, and more emphasis on things like liner notes and the credits. And also at one point they had a listening station. You could listen to it in advance. But the category thing is like, that's residual. That's like, since the industry began, it's like it's always like the guys in the suits trying to like, tell you what your music is, where it feels like you're being pigeonholed or something. And I don't even think that's gone away since the internet transformed the industry. Like, I think it's still a thing. I mean, there are now on streaming sites, Spotify, the playlisters, those communities, they'll give them different titles and stuff, but it can still feel a little confining to try to figure out on whose playlist you belong, And even within one piece, you could say that mine is a journey, and it hits so many different points along the way. It's hard for me to say like where my music truly belongs. And I get that, you know. I mean, I think maybe if everyone gets that going in, um, I don't know. I don't want them to necessarily try to call it one thing or another. I just want them to be part of a, a high energy experience. And
Well,
you know,
how would you, and I hate to use the word categorize it, but when you put yourself out there to get booked, at clubs, at venues and stuff like that, what do you say? If they say, what kind of music is it?
yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on the project. So
Yeah,
I
because
have two.
you have Dead Cat Bounce, you have Persiflage, and you have
Yeah,
yeah.
the dead cat bounce. I think the instrumentation always made it kind of like a strong identity type of project. It's just like, well, it's a sax quartet with rhythm section. All right, that's one aspect. It's like it's sometimes I would just like use a pull quote from a critic. Let someone else describe what it is, so I don't have to be the one to do it, you know. So it's just kind of like, a sax heavy sextet that stomps, swaggers, and wails. Like, I don't know, like, or
That's cool.
draws upon the two influences I would say that I would always cite were like World Sax Quartet meets Mingus. I don't know why I did that. I just did it because there's a lot of the personality of Mingus in the writing, and also obviously there is a sax. It's an impure sax quartet. So maybe that was in one way easier to pitch for that group. This Persiflage quintet that I have is a little more ethereal. There's a little more of like an ECM vibe going on with it. I think a lot about like Keith Jarrett's like American and European quartets from the 70s. Sometimes when I think about the writing for that, the writing is a little more sparse. Um, there's more openness for improvisation, and the improv doesn't necessarily have that usual run of the mill like solo over chord changes. It can much more easily go into collective improv. It can go um, it it dynamically. There's more contrast. I think that group has a propensity to get a lot more quiet in a lot of places. So it's not that loud brash approach to some jazz. It's like it can be the quieter side of jazz at points. Like the listener has to really like key in. Um, but it's very hard to describe that word. And the word, some people don't even know what the word means. Persiflage, it means like light and witty banter, kind of like almost like teasing each other kind of thing. And it feels that way on the bandstand when we're playing. So that's that group.
Let
I
me
have
let me
another.
actually
Yeah, go ahead.
let's explore that for a second. So, um, how do you? Because my question was going to be, how does the saxophone, if anything, inform your writing? But also with regard to this group too, how do you notate some of those types of things? And do you always have the same musicians in that Persiflage project?
No, actually, there's been two incarnations of that group on record, two albums, separated by a number of years, actually. And the second incarnation went through a lot of rotating personnel at live gigs before I finally settled on the group that would ultimately record the material. Um, and the characteristics of the two groups is different, and the repertoire. The repertoire of the old album had a little bit more of kind of some of the conventions of I would say like a certain period of jazz history that you would find more recognizable. There's aspects of like Randy Weston. I was really into his compositions at the time in some of that older repertoire. Um, it was more piano based, and the second group was more guitar. The chordal instrument was a guitarist, so it had a little more of a thinness to the texture to the sound of the second group compared to the first. The first group had a bunch of recognizable ringers, like Lonnie Plaxico was in that group. Um, Curtis Folks, a trombonist. So people of a certain generation know some of these names. They've played with like all the great people that you read about in textbooks. And then the second group is more of like this emergent scene of players that are just now starting to get recognized, but that were part of this Brooklyn, New York, kind of like an insider's scene from the time that I lived there. I was in New York City from '03 to 14, 11 years. And I lived in a neighborhood called Windsor Terrace, which is right near the Park Slope. So a bunch of guys in different places to play around those neighborhoods and stuff, and people who knew each other. And some of those people have really, really high profiles now, you know. So once I started writing for the second group, I kind of knew that there was like an aesthetic to the whole scene, not just those four other players, but actually like the way people in that whole scene tended to play, like their approach to, and a lot of times people they were doing free improv entirely, no score at all, or sometimes I'd look at, after watching someone else's gig, I'd ask, could I see like the chart? And it was like just a loose sketch, sometimes handwritten, you know.
Wow.
It made me rethink a lot about composition. Why does composition always have to be like so micromanaged, you know? If you trust those players and you know that you're enlisting their help because they do a certain kind of thing that you like, or the way they interact with one another is something that you want in your band, then you don't necessarily have to be such a control freak in the writing, you know? So I started experimenting with that group, with writing sometimes passages that had no chord changes. It was just like a single, there's a piece called Unison. It was just a unison line for like a page and a half. And it's written out in 11/8, but it's really more kind of it's more about phrases than playing like with a time signature, you know? And the freedom with which they play that is kind of what I wanted to unlock through that.
I'm curious about that. You know, so someone walks in on a rehearsal for that, and they see this unison line, no chord changes. And if this is someone that's coming from a college or university, it probably like throws them off, because they're used to, right? They're used to seeing chord changes and stuff like that. How do you guide? Well, of course, you're going to know who those players are because you're handpicking them. But, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the fact, first time seeing something like that, how do you guide your players, with regard to that?
Those guys, I don't have to say anything. Like,
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with whatever choices they're going to make, However, there are certain situations where I brought very loosely structured material into a rehearsal or a session. And sometimes I like to think, with melody emphasized writing as opposed to harmonic emphasized writing, I want them to unpack the line in different ways. Can you find like a shorter motif within the longer line, first of all? So thinking subtractively, so that chunk becomes a motive that you can then manipulate, transpose, play in retrograde, inverse retrograde, mess with the rhythms a bunch, like you can manipulate that in a number of ways. You can derive a pitch set from the existing melodic line, so you turn it into kind of like almost a scale. It might not be a scale that you can name per se, but it is bringing into account the written material. So maybe that's a point of departure for your improvisation as well. Or interval, like analyzing the intervallic content. I think sometimes not enough emphasis is put into this in jazz anyway. Most of the schools teach about chord scale theory with regard to improvisation, and it's really about the changes, but people like barely learn the melody and then they forget about it as soon as the solo begins, right? And the old, before there were music schools, like before it became an epidemic, the old apprenticeship model of like how people learn to play jazz on the bandstand at the jam sessions and stuff like that. I think there was a higher premium placed on learning the melody. In fact, learning the original lyrics to the melody if it was a standard, and that kind of like what's the even the etymology of the title of the song, what Tin Pan Alley writer wrote the song and why, what was the original Broadway show it came from, that kind of like all this like socio-cultural context for the piece. And that was more the old model than in the newer model, like the real book. And we all know that the real book sometimes can have inaccuracies in it anyway. So getting back to just being able to unpack other kinds of information besides just the chord symbol that's part of the challenge if you're writing in that way, that you're giving to the players to figure out for themselves. And I came at straight ahead jazz in the reverse in a way, because I had started by learning from people like Anthony Braxton, Thomas Chapin, people who were doing some very experimental things. And that was like early in my undergraduate, schooling. So to come back and then later on try to figure out how to learn bebop, it was in the reverse order from what a lot of people go through. So I was actually comfortable with that from the beginning.
What was that like, though? So, coming from more experimental to then learning bebop, how, was that harder?
It was a system that I knew I had to conquer eventually. But in the early going, I wasn't in such a rush to. But part of that was ignorance. I was just like, I thought I could just take enough from aping the aura of bebop without actually learning how to do it. And that got me through the first few years. But then I realized that I had to put more time in. But or even like post bop, or even like the Miles mid 60s second great quartet stuff, where it is actually kind of open and free, but it's also like using like that grew out of how they played standards in a new, unusual way. And then I kind of learned the importance of standards no matter what you're going to ultimately do. So I kind of then I started thinking about repertoire in that way, and not just like Tin Pan Alley standards, but Monk and Mingus and some of the other things you might hear called. I tried to get a little deeper inside that later on, and I needed help with that. So I needed Jerry Bergonzi to show me the way at that point.
Interesting. Now I'm going to track back to the question I had before. How does the saxophone inform your writing in any way, and how does it play into your projects and stuff like that? Is it like the central piece or not?
Increasingly less so, but in the beginning, yeah, like most of the time when it was instrumental music, because that was the main voice, and that was something that I hadn't put a lot of formal study into the instrumentation and orchestration of all the other instruments, as what a composer would do. So I was just working from what I was my main instrument, so that the range of the instrument I could more easily write for that, because I knew what would work and what it actually sounded like. If I wrote it on paper, I knew I could translate that to real sound. But now, after having tried to dabble on other instruments myself, and also having been through like orchestration writing classes and stuff, where like they would bring someone from the orchestra in, and you could write a test piece and have them play it and show you what worked and what didn't, then you start figuring out. And sometimes you just have to take a chance. Like if it's not your main instrument, write for it anyway and see what happens, and then you just have to adjust.
That's how you learn. That's how you learn about those instruments. For sure.
Yeah.
This is a good segue into like the electroacoustics and multimedia, right? Because it's you're expanding. You're expanding how you've written. This is the other point too I was going to make. When you first started, you mentioned before when you first started composing, like you'd really almost micromanage and try to write down everything. And now, it's evolved into something totally different. And I think the same thing, from the very beginning, you always thought about sound, right? And so that's another underlying theme too. So how has that evolved for you with like electroacoustics and stuff?
Well, my interest in electroacoustic music kind of grew out of me working on my doctoral dissertation at NYU, which is a composition degree that I have now in that. But the study, the thing being studied was actually about like social relations between like a case study of a test group, a band, Dead Cat Bounce actually, at the time. But I wanted there to be a lived experience of them going through a collaborative music making process together. And I wanted it to come out of, I wanted to feel more stake in the creation of the new work, to feel more invested in that creation from early on, so that it didn't feel like I was just bringing in a ready to go chart and they just show up for the rehearsal and we just kind of like grind it out and do it. So I had them do field recordings, to choose their own field recordings along a given theme, and then write journal entries in response to their field recorded, their choices of things that they recorded, and that those turned into inspiration for like a loose, like a rubric to improvise to in like a collective improv, which was recorded, and then from that I kind of like analyzed that and turned that gradually into a score for a new work, and lots of conversations in between, lots of reciprocity in the process. So certain technical hurdles had to be in place to deal with those new constraints, those new challenges. And I wanted to be able to manipulate their sound in the improv and and explore new timbres as a result. So I did accumulate some stuff, like Ableton Live and a bunch of new mics and MIDI controllers um, and different filters and ways of digital signal processing the mic'd sound, and being able to like put it back into a feedback loop and trigger samples, trigger their own field recordings in different ways, manipulate those field recordings in different ways. And so that it became like this all-inclusive study that was actually a multimedia 90-minute work, where there was like a video artist that we collaborated with as well in this kind of like multimedia space. So that's how it all was all born. And since then I have some of that gear. I'll use it now to create some of that pop song material that's up on the Bandcamp now. I've been using kind of like the pandemic times to explore that side of me a little bit more.
I was going to ask you that, what have you been doing since the pandemic? I can't say we're almost at the end of it. Who knows when we're at the end of it? But we're filming this in April 2021.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been hunkering down, trying to wait it out like anybody else. Luckily, I had some gear. I bought some more, because I knew I wasn't going to be playing with people. I have done a few remote asynchronous improvisations via video with people. Like someone will lay down a track first, someone else will improvise to it. I bought a green screen so that we put a background behind us and it kind of looks like we're in the same room. And so that's kind of cool for like free improv experimental things. And
Not
then
playing not playing at the same time though, right? Because of the latency and stuff, or do you have software?
no, it's asynchronous. So
Yeah.
yeah, one person at a time.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is a different.
It's hard.
It's just you have to evaluate it on its own terms. It doesn't make sense to compare it with something else. But there are some examples of that, and I thought that with some interesting results. So, but then the songwriting stuff. I mean, I've always had an interest in it, but I didn't necessarily have the gear to do it at home myself, and I didn't have the confidence to bring it into a pay-by-the-hour recording studio before. But I started doing that with my album from last year, before the pandemic, that was released last year before the pandemic. It was mostly jazz, but it was a double album. But 4 of the pieces, which were some of the more radio-friendly cuts, were pop songs that featured different singers. Actually, more R&B, more on the side of like R&B and rock and global pop stuff, which sounds anathema to everything else that I seem to be about. But if you go back to those early vinyl days with my dad's record collection, it's not surprising at all. So that was always within me, but now it's just starting to come out. And I've recorded some of the more of those things, those types of things at home since I've had to be here alone in the house.
How are you looking ahead to the rest of 2021? What other projects are coming along? And, are there any, are you able to schedule any public performances and stuff?
Well, I had a regular quartet that I was rehearsing with, and we played a couple of shows with before the lockdown happened when I was teaching at a university in Canada for 3 years. Um, so those guys were currently putting together a demo to apply for a grant that, if funded, would turn into a new album recording that where I would go back up there to record with them. And that would be a co-led project with myself and one of this person I alluded to early in the podcast. He was a friend of the family's who is more my dad's age, and he writes a lot of music. He lives in Winnipeg, Canada, and but he's American born from Long Island himself, but now a dual citizen. And so it's co-led project where we write the material equally, and that's kind of fun too. I've been doing a lot of collaborations. That Yang Yin tune was co-written with myself, an old college friend of mine who's a brilliant singer-songwriter, Dave Cope. Um, Another friend of mine, Anna Nyack, who's a great producer, kind of like a Grammy-nominated producer, actually, has helped me make my recorded songs sound better remotely this year. Um, so yeah, I think it. I think real live gigs may be further down the road, but I'm sort of planting the seeds for that now with some of the recording project pitches, some more remote song by song types of collaborations, and then also kind of like with Jazz Fuel, with the PR side of things, and also the grant side of things, just and the label, because I had a record on recently on Rope-A-Dope, just trying to get these other stakeholders in the music industry to sort of like coalesce on a project, for giving the project some legs once it's released, which will eventually include playing live, but I don't know. I'm not trying to pin down a time frame when that actually happens yet, because it's a wait and see. I'm vaccinated now, but I don't know what the venues are thinking at this point.
No, for sure. And what's really what I found interviewing bunches of people since lockdown, what's really interesting is that everybody is learning new skills, and I think there's a lot of positivity out of this because you had mentioned before about not having some of the tools that at home that you would use for recording and whatnot. You'd started to acquire them, started to get more knowledge, gain more knowledge how to use them, thinking like even singer songwriter types of things or whatever. I think everybody's going to come out of this stronger, and you're going to see a lot more different type of material coming out from everybody, because of the newly gained knowledge. And also sometimes, if you are in the house alone, sitting and reflecting, it does, it will have you access different, parts of yourself that, maybe you just didn't have time to reflect upon before, and I think it's just going to really, change things in music.
It's true. I mean, you can either get really dark about it, or you can try to make lemonade. I don't know. What choice do you have, right? So um, that's what we're
Yeah.
all trying to do here, and it's been fascinating seeing what other people can come up with, and I'm by no means like an expert on all this technical stuff, but it's been fun learning. I've been trying to get better on the saxophone too on my own time. I think it'll be a little initially like I'll feel a little rusty once I start playing more with live people again. But certain things I am getting a little more focus. I've played, I've learned by heart a few more transcriptions, solo transcriptions. I've done um, some more work with my altissimo and just evening out my range. in general. I don't know. It makes me feel good to play sax, even if it's by myself. I mean, it's been always like a form of therapy in a way. So I guess I'll keep doing that too.
Yeah, for sure. Now, before we go, can you let us know where people can find you? Website, social media, where they can buy your albums?
Um, yeah, everything is under. Well, the easiest place that can link out to everything else is mattystecks.com.
Okay.
MattyStecks. Um, but if you're interested in purchasing any of the records I put out, yeah, Bandcamp. So mattystecks.com can link out to that, but it's really mattystecks.bandcamp.com. That can also link to the other projects, Persiflage and Dead Cat Bounce. Um,
And what about social media?
Yup. Matty Stecks is pretty much for all of them. Facebook, I'm on there as that. Twitter, Instagram, um, even TikTok now, although I don't use it much.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's just an experiment. um, yeah. So, is there anything else? LinkedIn. I'm trying them all. I'm trying. You know.
Yeah, it's that's a full-time job in and of itself. Listen,
Spotify. I'm on there as well.
Spotify too, that's right. Listen, Maddie, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. I know you're on a tight schedule and you've been very generous, with your time being here. This was really an interesting, fascinating interview and learning so much about you, but also, again, how listening to all those different recordings on vinyl, and having the people around you, how much of an effect it's had on your career and your approach to music. I think it's really cool.
Oh, thank you. Well, it certainly takes 90 minutes to be able to get through all that, doesn't it? So, um, it's rare to have that amount of time to be able to introduce yourself. So I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely, for sure.